Starting back from scratch, thank you, Curtis M. Lawson, for inviting me to participate, and congratulations on the release of To Kill an Archangel Bad World 2, the follow-up to It's a Bad, 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 Bad World, which I would swear I saw a movie with a title similar to that like years ago. But, quick shout out, belated happy birthday to my friend Dan Reed, who celebrated yesterday, and happy belated St. Patrick's Day to everybody and to anyone who's watching here today with a post St. Patrick's Day hangover. You're my people. I appreciate you being here. Looking down the road, later this week, the next 3 days, three of the most important people in my life, I'll also celebrate birthdays. So in order, happy early birthdays to Jillian Booth on Monday, to Laura J. Hickman on Tuesday, and to Dave Regan on Wednesday. I love all you guys. I'm going to read a story today from my collection, Monochromes and Other Stories, which came out from Haverhill House Publishing last year. I'm going to read a story called Before Parachutes, but I want to dedicate this story specifically today to my friend Frank Raymond Michaels, because Frank went through some really major surgery just last week, and he came through with flying colors, and the prognosis is as good as anyone could have hoped for. And he came through the surgery in time to post probably the best, and not just best, but most insightful 5-star review that my book has ever received just yesterday, and that really made my St. Patrick's Day. And he cited this story as one of his favorites and even quoted the last line of this story in his review. So Frank, thank you. I am so glad things are going so well, and this is for you. This is a story called Before Parachutes. Old Luke's business began shortly after the Wright brothers, but well before the term skydiving was ever coined. The first year or so was lean, so lean that Luke still crop dusted in his spare time and rented out the extra space in his hangar for storage. Then came Jake. After Jake, Luke's fortune was set. Jake's legend was such that Luke did good business after parachutes hit the scene, and the fatality rate for people jumping out of planes plummeted. Jake didn't need no parachute, Luke would say and beam at the bar, the bourbon stinging the nicks in his infected gums. He had a banner of those words printed and hung it from the awning outside his office. He tripled his average business the week it went up. Luke was careful about the customers he took on. No drunks were allowed to sign up for his flights. An impeccable mental health history was mandatory. And, of course, there were the waivers. Unlike you, Luke would joke as a passenger signed on, I have to have a safety net. When a customer didn't laugh, Luke knew he would probably back out. This isn't to say old Luke was a stickler. In fact, he made all the allowances he could for his customers in good faith. He'd schedule their flights for whatever time they desired to jump, be it sunrise, sunset, high noon, or dead of night. He'd let his customers bring friends to keep them company. Once a man brought a reverend to administer last rites. Another time a man brought a hooker. That story went over best late night at the bar. One of the last flights he piloted, shortly before the stroke left him paralyzed on his left side and forced him into early retirement, Luke brought his nephew Harold for the ride. Harold was a plain and meager boy who Luke always knew would amount to much more. Someday, he promised the boy, when I shuffle off this earth, I'm leaving you the old bag of bolts. Then he kissed the plane's propeller. He always kissed his plane after he insulted it in public, like most men do their wives. This is it, Luke called to the customer, a man of about 40 who lived entirely too boring a life. You can jump any time in the next 2 minutes. After that, I gotta veer off, or else I'll run face first in the mountains and I'll have a whole mess of disappointed people down below. Luke tried to tussle Harold's hair, even though he wore a buzz cut, including this tack's parents. The man standing on the wing flinched, suddenly clenching one of the supports with white knuckles. Tell me again about Jake, he pleaded. What's to tell? Old Luke called back. He made it. He leapt off that wing, right where you're standing, fell thousands of feet to that very earth you're perched over, and then walked into town to thank me for the thrill of his life. You've seen the picture of us afterwards, right? The man nodded. It was the greatest day of my life, and I can't even begin to imagine how Jake felt. Luke looked back and winked at him. Harold turned to study the altimeter, and when the boy looked back, the man was gone. Another satisfied customer, Luke bragged, patting his nephew on the knee. I tell you, boy, there's nothing like servicing the people and knowing you've done a job well. Harold swallowed hard. Don't you ever feel bad, Uncle Luke? Luke produced his hip flask and took a swig, a tradition upon making a drop. What for? He asked. For killing all those people. Luke turned to face his nephew. Harold, he said with the solemnity of death in his voice, I ain't killing nobody. Life kills enough people as is. Me? I'm just giving them one hell of a ride out. But you know they're going to die, Harold stammered. Old Luke grinned with whatever teeth he had left. Not necessarily, my boy. Not necessarily. Aw, come on, Uncle Luke, Harold scoffed. I'm a little old to believe in Jake. Everyone knows that picture was taken before he jumped. Luke raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? Just who fed you that whopper? All the guys at school. They say you're nothing but a carnival barker with a plane. Luke skimmed the clouds with his plane's belly. Do you believe them? He asked. Harold looked at his feet. I don't want to. Why don't you want to? Harold grinned. Because I do believe in you. Luke's smile overtook his entire chin. That's what I like to hear, my boy. That's what I like to hear. So could you tell me again about Jake? Harold asked. Not much to tell, Luke said. He always loved the mystery that surrounded the legend. He was an average man. Not too tall, not too short, not too skinny or fat. He never gave me his reason for signing up. Call me a romantic, but personally, I like to think he had a broken heart. He was a quiet guy, never said much to me one way or the other. It was just me and him on that daybreak flight. When the time came, he thanked me, stepped out on the wing, and jumped. I've heard some people say he landed in a lake, Harold interrupted. He could have. Or that trees broke his fall. Could have. Harold studied his uncle. You don't wonder? Luke shook his head vigorously. Not in the least. So what happened when he came back? Harold loved the end to this story. Well, you see, Luke fired up his showmanship charm, that's the darndest part of the whole shindig. I was sitting at the saloon 2 nights later, partaking of a fine cocktail, when Jake walks through the front door. The whole place goes dead, silent, quiet as a deaf mouse. Luke drew his words out in a dramatic, hushed voice. Everybody knows this was my last customer, come walking back after I dropped him off at the pearly gates. I shot off my stool, but I just stood there, staring, just like everybody else in the joint. Jake walks up to me, not looking at anyone else, and shakes my hand. That's when the barkeep snapped that famous photograph of the 2 of us. What'd he say, Uncle Luke? He said, thank you. Luke's voice trailed off in reverence. He said, thank you, old Luke. You were right. It was the greatest thrill of my life. Then he turned back around and walked out. The 2 sat in the glow of Jake's legend for a long while. And no one's seen him since, huh? Harold confirmed. Not a pair of eyes I've met. Where do you think he went? Luke smiled and slurped from his flask. Call me a romantic, he said, but I like to think he went back and mended that broken heart of his. Lived happily ever after. And you really don't care how he did it? Harold asked. I never said that, old Luke pointed out. I said I never wondered. It took a second for it to sink into Harold. You know how he did it, the boy yelled. Luke smiled at his nephew. Of course I do. He nodded, letting the boy in on his best-guarded secret. I've always known. How'd he do it? You really want to know? The old pilot teased. Of course I do, Harold begged. Everyone wants to know how Jake did it. The thing is, I always knew. I knew long before I ever met Jake, and long before Jake ever became a legend. It was why I started my business in the first place. Uncle Luke, just tell me, Harold pleaded. Old Luke smiled like a bear trap as he finally let someone in on his great secret. The thing is, he explained, a man can survive anything.